Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Vanderhoeft, and I'm a professor of Hebrew Bible in the Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences Department of Theology, and I'd like to welcome you all tonight. In part also on behalf of our co-sponsors, the Boston College Institute for the Liberal Arts, the Catholic Biblical Association, and the Confraternity of Catholic Doctrine, the School of Theology and Ministry Program and Continuing Education, and the Joseph Chair in Catholic Spirituality. We're grateful to all of them for supporting us. But it's my specific task to welcome and introduce this evening's speaker. He is the Helena Professor of Old Testament Literature and Exegesis at Princeton Theological Seminary and Skirball Professor Emeritus of Bible and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at New York University. He taught previously at St. Joseph's University, Philadelphia's Jesuit University, Yale University, and St. Paul's Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He earned his doctorate from Yale University, with additional graduate studies pursued at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, as well as postdoctoral study on the Dead Sea Scrolls there. A past president and vice president of the Catholic Biblical Association, he served as visiting professor at the Pontifical Biblical Institute and at the Hebrew University. His research focuses on particularly biblical literature, Israelite religion, and Canaanite texts, especially those from the ancient city of Ugarit. He's the author of 16 books and the co-author of 4 others. He also has over 120 additional essays and publications. His books include How Human is God? 7 Questions About God and Humanity in the Bible, published in 2014. The Priestly Vision of Genesis 1, published by Fortress Press in 2010. And The Genesis of Good and Evil, the Fallout and Original Sin in the Bible, in this year, 2019, from Westminster John Knox Press. In the sphere of Ugaritic studies, he has made many and critical contributions, perhaps most notably the monumental 2-volume publication and commentary on the Baal cycle. His current research includes a commentary on the biblical book of Judges for the series Hermeneia, published by Fortress Press, co-authored with the archaeologist and, as he reports, the love of his life, Elizabeth Blocksmith. They're also, he reminds me, the proud parents of 3 really great-looking, brilliant children who do not visit them often enough. On a personal note, I'd like to recall that our speaker attended a class in which I was enrolled as an undergraduate sophomore, so about a dozen or so years ago. Much as some of you today are undergraduate sophomores and joining us. But my fonder recollection of that class was of the encouragement that I remember him giving me as an individual when merely a lowly sophomore, which played a role in my choice of majors and, for better or worse, depending on how you ask my students, my profession. So, it is for me a very great pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker and my good friend, Professor Mark Smith.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much for the water. Good evening. I'm very honored and grateful to be here and to be invited here. This evening, I would like to tell a story in 3 parts. The first is about the Catholic setting of our meeting here as we study the Church's Old Testament, often called by scholars the Hebrew Bible. Just to be clear, I will not be addressing the New Testament tonight. The second part of tonight's story concerns the modern study of the Hebrew Bible, specifically in relation to written sources outside of the Bible. The third part of our story is how this modern study has influenced the understanding of God in the Bible. The landscape of our sources from what we might call the biblical world is broad. For tonight's purposes, this landscape of the ancient Near East ranges from ancient Mesopotamia, that is modern-day Syria, Iraq, etc., all the way to Egypt, and covering a period of about 1,500 years before the time of Christ. Now let me begin the first part of this story, namely our context here. This meeting invites us to pause to appreciate the labors of biblical scholarship. The Catholic Church's modern teaching on the Bible is not uncommonly traced to the 1943 encyclical Divino Afflante Spiritu. Yet long before this important event was Pope Leo XIII's 1893 encyclical Providentissimus Deus, the first important papal document on Scripture in modern times, that is, according to the fine history of the Pontifical Biblical Institute written by the Jesuit Maurice Gilbert. Leo XIII had already granted the charter for the École Biblique in Jerusalem, founded under the prodigious and brilliant yet wrongly persecuted Marie-Joseph Lagrange. In 1897, the Catholic University of America would follow suit, opening what it then called the Department of Oriental Studies. It no longer has that name. It was found under the great Coptic and Semitic scholar Henri Ivernat. In 1909, the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome was founded under Pius X. In the words of Gilbert, it was, he says, quote, after 2 centuries of stagnation, end quote, that the Pontifical Biblical Institute, again, quote, aimed at restoring the fortunes of Catholic exegesis. Gilbert's point applies no less to the École Biblique and the Catholic University of America in Washington. These foundational institutions, as well as their later sibling institution, such as the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, would help to bring deep linguistic and cultural learning to biblical studies in the Catholic and Jewish worlds, ultimately laying the groundwork for a new ecumenical sensibility in biblical studies. My point is simple. Schools matter, and persons, both papal and professorial, likewise mattered for the development of biblical studies and for the massive change witnessed in the church in the 20th century. And we already know this. Many of us here have been deeply influenced by the Second Vatican Council, which promulgated both Dei Verbum, underscoring the place of the Bible in the life of the church, and Nostra Aetate, with its massive redefinition of Jewish-Catholic relations. Now, I cannot stress enough the role of the Jesuits in these developments, whether I refer to the Pontifical Biblical Institute or to the Jesuits' many members with their innumerable scholarly achievements working on the Bible in its ancient Near Eastern setting. All of these accomplishments have been gifts to the church and ultimately songs of praise to God. I single out here one Jesuit biblical scholar who has extensively used the ancient texts of Syria and Mesopotamia to leverage deeper readings of the Bible. And that is my teacher and my friend, who I believe is still here. That's my teacher and friend, Dick Clifford, who is with us tonight. Thank you, Dick. Dick pursues and has pursued for decades a very Catholic vision of studying the Bible in its full ancient Near Eastern context. In many respects, this symposium represents the joint realization of Dei Verbum and Nostra Aetate, bringing together Jewish, Catholic, Protestant experts on the Bible and texts from Mesopotamia. As Psalm 113 says, Hine ma tovu manayim shevet achim gam yachad, which I loosely translate for this occasion. Hear how good and how beautiful it is to sit as siblings all together. And to mark a new moment, Jews may say a prayer known as the Shehechianu, which praises God literally as the, quote, the one that has given us life. Here and now, we may be grateful for this life, and we may feel great gratitude for our place in this great chain of biblical scholarship and teaching. We may also hope to forge stronger links for its future, not only in the academy, but also in conjunction with churches, synagogues, and mosques. We have so much to do. So, what has all this scriptural labor of love meant? From an ecclesial perspective, modern biblical scholarship has meant a shared project of study that takes place within and across faith communities for their mutual benefit. From a theological perspective, one of the greatest achievements of modern biblical criticism has been to shed light on the many and deep ways in which revelation is embedded in human cultural experience and literary expression. As a result, biblical criticism serves to help revelation shine a bit more brightly in its varied human dimensions. It lifts up the Bible's incarnated character, and it holds the potential for deepening our sense of the biblical mystery of God. Historical criticism that takes in not only the Bible, but also the ancient Near East, with its different impacts on the Bible, is fundamentally Catholic in its wide-ranging probing of the Bible, of Israelite identity, and its God. This is what this whole meeting is all about. Now, this leads me to the second part of my story tonight, which considers scholarly comparisons that have been made between the Bible and texts outside of the Bible. For a long time, scholars compared the Bible with sources outside of the Bible, whether those sources came from Egypt, Mesopotamia, or closer to Israel, or even inside of Israel, all sources outside the Bible. Conceptually, scholars approach the comparative task in terms of the Bible and the ancient Near East, or even in oppositional terms, the Bible versus the ancient Near East. These approaches elevated the Bible over and against extra-biblical sources, often with a prior theological assumption of Israelite distinctiveness and superiority. These modern approaches to historical comparison of biblical and extra-biblical sources, in fact, reflect what has long been a question for the church, as captured by the church father Tertullian, who famously asked, "What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church?" Biblical sources themselves pose the comparable question for the revelation of the scriptures. What have Canaan and Babylon to do with Israel? To judge from the books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges, the answer seems clear. Israel has nothing to do with Canaan or its gods. And several passages, such as Psalm 137, could follow suit for Babylon. Quote, "By the rivers of Babylon there we sat, also we wept as we remembered Zion." Babylon and Zion, that is Jerusalem, are polar opposites in this psalm. Tertullian's question, as it applies to the Bible, received a sort of update in Peter Machinist's 1990 article. Peter is also with us here tonight. His article is entitled "The Question of Distinctiveness in Ancient Israel." Machinist notes the intellectual failures of modern scholars to isolate Israel's distinctiveness, sometimes thought, I think wrongly, to be its monotheism and its morality. Brilliantly, I think, Machinist shifts the issue to what Israel repeatedly in its Bible gave as its own answer to the question of distinctiveness, namely the simple fact that Israel understood itself and its God to be distinctive. Machinist's careful assessment of the biblical evidence highlights a wide range of passages that, quote, "speak of Israel or one of its representative groups or individuals, including its God, as distinct from outsiders, whether humans or gods." That's a quote. Machinist seems to view this feature as basic to Israelite identity, and he also isolates the distinctive social, cultural factor, namely Israel's, quote, "status as newcomer and marginal." Now, I can't really do justice to this rich article. I can show it to you. I have it in my file here. But I want to suggest that its insights raise three challenges for our reflection on Israel's sense of distinctiveness within the Bible. First, the very name of Israel, in Hebrew, Yisrael, thank you, does not show the divine element of the name of Yahweh, but of the god El. That is, proper names often contain the name of the deity. And in the case of Israel, it's not Yisra Yahweh or Yisra Yahu or some form like this, but Yisrael. So when Machinus says it's God, in other words, Israel's God, does it matter which God, El or Yahweh? Second, and related, is there evidence for Israel's sense of self-distinctiveness before the monarchies of Israel and Judah? That is it truly primordial in any real sense? As expected, the vast preponderance of biblical evidence cited by Machinus does not date before Kings. Even the older poems in the Bible bearing on the issue are arguably not pre-monarchic. Thus, one may ask if Israel's sense of distinctiveness was no less a function of its emergence as a kingdom later, including its subjection to Mesopotamian empires. Third and finally, Israel's own answer to the question of other peoples and their gods is actually not entirely negative. On the one hand, Machinus very rightly shows how the Bible commonly gives a negative answer to this question. On the other hand, several passages from the Pentateuch and historical books show Israelites engaging with non-Israelites in different manners that recognize the gods of the others without any hint of conversion or condescension. In other words, what scholars have called God in translation. For example, Deuteronomy 32:8-9 tells how the god Elyon, perhaps El, gave the various nations to the other various gods as their inherited territories. And in this scheme, Israel is Yahweh's territory in the world inheritance of the gods. Another example, in Judges, the leader named Jephthah asks his Ammonite counterpart, quote, "Should you not possess what Chemosh your God gives you to possess? And should we not possess everything that Yahweh our God has given us to possess?" That's a quote from Judges chapter 11, verse 24. These sorts of passages would come to be interpreted in monotheistic terms, but in themselves they are not very monotheistic. So yes, the Bible overall rejects translatability of divinity, yet it did not erase all indications of translatability. In other words, the Bible's own answer is a series of different answers. Since the 1970s, the academic field of biblical studies has witnessed a major shift in the paradigm toward understanding the Bible and the ancient Near East, toward a paradigm of the Bible in the ancient Near East, noting that the Bible historically and culturally is largely not separate from the ancient Near East. This is not a matter that can be entirely demonstrated in a single presentation, but I'm going to offer in summary form two major sets of comparisons central to the idea of the Bible in the ancient Near East, or as I prefer, the ancient Near East in the Bible. My first set of comparisons of the Hebrew Bible is with this late Bronze Age text discovered at the ancient city of Ugarit, a site located on the coast of Syria, about 100 miles north of modern Beirut. That's in Lebanon. I will refer to these as the Ugaritic Texts. They're often called Canaanite texts. It's a slight misnomer, but not by a lot. The second major impact in the study of the Bible from a comparative perspective comes from northern Syria and Mesopotamia. This impact was made at a variety of times, but especially in the wake of Assyrian influence from about the 9th century onwards, itself the central topic of this meeting. Now first, the Ugaritic texts. Soon after the first Ugaritic texts were discovered in 1928, their similarities with the Bible were recognized. Now, of course, the Bible has some distinctive features not shared with the Ugaritic texts, such as the name of Yahweh, the tradition of this God's home in the Sinai, or the tradition of the Exodus from Egypt. Moreover, we also remain very aware that we are always comparing apples and oranges, which is actually the title of Bruce Lincoln's 2018 book discussing the intellectual problems with comparison and yet the need to compare. I recommend the introduction. Bruce Lincoln, Apples and Oranges, Explorations in, on, and with Comparison, University of Chicago, 2018. At the same time, there's no denying that there's a very substantial base of shared features between Ugaritic or the Ugaritic texts and the Bible. These are features of language, poetic styles, and specific literary traditions. Language studies have reinforced the view of Hebrew's relative proximity to Ugaritic language, along with Phoenician, Ammonite, and Moabite, but as opposed to Aramaic and even further afield to Akkadian. Indeed, early biblical Hebrew compares closely to Ugaritic, sometimes more closely than it does to biblical Hebrew after the exile in the Persian and Hellenistic periods. In the realm of poetry, book-length studies have shown the many shared features in Ugaritic and Hebrew Bible poetry, as well as a large shared literary tradition, including motifs and type scenes. Especially, go home and read Psalm 29 sometime. You're basically reading Canaanite literature. And yet, the literary and religious features shared by the Ugaritic texts in the Bible include not just general thematic parallels or literary type elements, but even the very same proper names. The very name of Israel itself, it's in Ugaritic. The names of the gods, goddesses El, Baal, and Asherah, as well as some of their titles, such as Baal's title, the rider of the clouds. This appears as Yahweh's title in modified form. All of these elements, specific with concrete names, are in the Ugaritic texts, and they are in the Hebrew Bible. Even the name of the great enemy, Leviathan, and the seven-headed dragon. You think of Psalms or maybe the book of Revelation, they're at Ugaritic first. This is not to say that some of these shared features in Ugaritic in the Bible do not have an earlier or wider ancient Near Eastern context prior to what we see at Ugaritic. However, the names given to these features do not belong to Mesopotamia, but to the cultural context shared by Ugaritic and the Bible. Perhaps put more strongly, the Ugaritic text and the Hebrew Bible both belong to a larger cultural tradition that ranges from Ugaritic in the north to at least Jerusalem in the south, and from the Mediterranean coast on the west to the region of the Transjordan in the east. It is an assumption, and I think a rather problematic one, to think of early Israel as a separate culture relative to the traditions along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean that the Bible shares with Ugaritic, as well as other later sources, such as the Phoenician history of Philo of Byblos. Okay, now for a brief comparison of Bible and Mesopotamia. In the 9th century, Israel began to encounter the emerging empires of Mesopotamia. Assyria would invade Israel, defeating the northern kingdom of Israel in 722, and then conquering the southern kingdom of Judah in 701. Both of these Assyrian conquests exerted significant influence on Israel and Judah, not to mention significant deportations of Israelite and Judean populations to Assyria. After 722, the Assyrian Empire established new provinces next to Judah. In the late 7th century, in the late 600s, Assyria was supplanted by the Babylonian Empire, which defeated Jerusalem and Judah 3 times, 597, 586, and 582, once again issuing insignificant enslavements and deportations to Mesopotamia. Now, with these events, we enter into the arena explored by the many papers of our meeting. These suggest great complexity and nuance in the Mesopotamian Israelite engagement over the course of these and later centuries. The engagements of Mesopotamian powers with and in ancient Israel might seem at first glance to reinforce traditional categories of Israel and the ancient Near East, or the Bible and the ancient Near Eastern texts. Yet, with Mesopotamia in the first millennium, it is more. It is more accurate to think of the ancient Near East coming to Israel, invading, conquering, occupying Israel. With Mesopotamia, its invasions made direct impacts on the Bible. This cultural contact is not simply an issue of coming out of the same or overlapping cultural context, which I discussed for the Ugaritic texts, shared background. Rather, we're talking about Assyria invading the Bible, Signs of Mesopotamian influence on ancient Israelite culture are clear in the archaeology, the lexicon, and religious terms in the Bible. The Bible itself provides two very striking examples of Mesopotamian God and Goddess. The first is the Tammuz, mentioned in Ezekiel 8:14, and the second is the Queen of Heaven in Jeremiah's chapters 7 and 44. Now, the Queen of Heaven, she's not identified by name in those chapters in the Bible. She's been identified with a variety of goddesses, some indigenous to this area, such as Astarte. Still, some Mesopotamian component is indicated by her association with a sort of baked good, as shown by the Hebrew word kavan in Jeremiah, which is a loan word from Akkadian kamanu. In addition, there is pictorial evidence for the goddess Ishtar that was discovered within Israel. Thus, in the case of this goddess, there is a convergence of language, religious iconography, and biblical texts pointing to this Mesopotamian goddess's intercultural impact in Israel. This example of the Queen of Heaven shows the case for the idea of my formulation, the ancient Near East in the Bible. The ancient Near East in the Bible is also evident in the Bible's own literary production. We see this thanks to many Akkadian loanwords found in the Bible, and many of the scholars here at this meeting have noted many examples of Akkadian words and phrases, thoughts, ideas adapted in the Hebrew Bible, notably in the biblical books of Deuteronomy, 2 Kings, and Isaiah. Furthermore, whether directly or not, Mesopotamia may have furnished models for the biblical flood traditions, biblical law. There's a famous and debated comparison of the covenant code, these chapters in Exodus 21 to 23, compared with the Code of Hammurabi. And perhaps another model from Mesopotamia, maybe, is the type of historical reporting is found in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. The complex mediation processes are not entirely clear, yet their influence and engagement now appear undeniable. More importantly, to my mind, it is not simply the fact of borrowing or even the processes that are at stake here. It's also, what did our Israelite authors do with them? Put one way, and perhaps it's a bit of an overstatement, biblical authors added their own literary talent to the literary talents of the Akkadian texts that they recycled. For example, in the case of the Covenant Code in Exodus 21:23, its writers added a large supplement to the material that has been compared to the Code of Hammurabi, and they also added a frame for the code. Thus, it is not only where in the ancient Near East these works or motifs were from, it was also where are they going as they found new homes in Israel's Bible. On important biblical matters such as covenant or prophecy, the Bible is hardly exceptional, as scholars have shown repeatedly throughout the 20th century. But the manner in which the Bible creatively recycles and expands on covenant and prophecy does appear exceptional. And much of this creativity is literary creativity. Together, the Ugaritic texts in Mesopotamia show us how the Bible reflects 1,000 years of Israelite experience contending with the larger world. Classics of literature, whether created in a short or long time, creatively incorporate a mass of language and metaphor, observations and insights based on the social, political, and religious worldviews and experiences of their societies. As a classic, the Bible reworked Israel's experience into imaginative forms about what has been, what is, and what could be. Addressed to Israel, the Bible stands as Israel's mirror to itself, and also Israel's mirror to the world. It is as if Israel attended 1,000 Passover Seders together, and they argued over God, Israel, and the world, and then they left us with their best reflections resulting from their discussions. These works of the Bible were gradually collected as a single work that we call the Bible, which would further distinguish it from other ancient Near Eastern textual traditions. The anthology came to be read as a single work and sometimes cross-referenced as a single work. This, I suspect, is another approach to the question of Israel's distinctiveness. This literary project that we call the Bible is arguably weighted to the experience of loss in the wake of Assyrian and Babylonian conquests. This is not an uncommon observation. It's more recognizable when we note that within the Bible, its royally produced passages constitutes a small corpus compared to the many responses to monarchy found in the Bible's prophetic and priestly works, in Deuteronomy and Deuteronomistic works, in Joshua through Kings, and arguably in the Pentateuch as well. This point emerges not only when we compare what we can really see as royal literature within the Bible to other texts in the Bible, but it also emerges when we note the relatively small numbers of royally produced texts in the Bible relative to other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Egypt, Ugaritic, the Hittites, Mesopotamia produced thousands of texts under their monarchies. By contrast, the proportion is quite small in the Bible. I'm not going to rehearse all of that, but let me put it this way. The Bible may show a good deal of information about the monarchy, but it contains relatively few texts for kings and by royal scribes per se. Even the Bible's royal historical writing in 1st and 2nd Kings, substantial as it is embedded in the books of Kings thanks to later non-royal writers who literally footnoted their monarchic period sources. Are these not written in the record of the deeds of Solomon, 1 Kings 11? Are these not written in the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, or in the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, all throughout 1st and 2nd Kings? They footnote their sources. While biblical scholars may point to any number of source materials in the Bible going back to the monarchy, the proportion of texts in the Bible produced for, about, and by the monarchy is fairly small in comparison both with other biblical texts and with other ancient Near Eastern cultures. And after all, isn't this, in a sense, what we might expect? Royal archives are what we've recovered largely from many of these ancient Near Eastern cultures, but this is not the case for the Bible. The Bible is not a royal archive. This highlights a major point for me, which is the Bible is largely a post-monarchic project. Let me illustrate my point with what you might think is a silly metaphor. And I'm not sure it actually applies in Boston. Oh, you'll hear why. The Hebrew Bible is the best donut you've ever had. And the monarchy is basically the hole in the middle of your delicious donut. The hole is prominent. Your donut is no donut without it. What we hold and eat of this donut is what's around the hole. Thus, perhaps more than we imagine, the Bible is in large measure a series of responses to the monarchy and its loss in the wake of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, later the Persians. So what does this mean for the biblical God? At this point, we turn to the third part of my story, God in the Hebrew Bible. As I've intimated, the early story of divinity in the Bible reflects a context shared with Ugaritic, and it was impacted further by Israel's engagement with Mesopotamia. Israel also generated its own collection process within post-monarchic contours. So how does our look at ancient Near East in the Bible affect how we think about God in the Bible? A short answer, God goes as Israel goes. And its complex expressions about God point not only to the complexity of Israel's experience, but also to the complexity of Israel's sense of God. Or from the point of view of Revelation, wherever God brings Israel, God goes in its understanding of divinity. Or again, from a historical perspective, as Israel brings the ancient Near East into its Bible, so it marks its representations of divinity. Put theologically, God has brought ancient Near Eastern conceptualizations of divinity to Israel and into its Bible. Israel and its God bears a vast, even Catholic expression in the Bible. How so? Earlier, I suggested that the name of Israel is paralleled in the Ugaritic Texts, and that this name reflects the name of the god El, who was a major god at Ugarit. As many scholars have long argued, this early god of Israel, that is El, would be identified with Yahweh. So the point remains, El may have been the original God of Israel. And in its own way, the Bible seems to agree. When Moses meets Yahweh for the first time in the book of Exodus, meets Yahweh in the book of Exodus in chapter 6, Yahweh tells Moses about his earlier appearances made to the patriarchs in the book of Genesis. Quote, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name Yahweh. That's the quote. According to this passage, Yahweh was not known as Yahweh to the patriarchs, including Jacob, himself called Israel in the book of Genesis. Originally, Israel only knew this God as El. Now, however one understands the full title El Shaddai in this quote, this title, it's an El title. This title in the priestly sections of Genesis serves as the rubric for all of the different El titles in the other sources or traditions in Genesis. Theologically, El Shaddai's secondary identification as Yahweh looks like revelation unfolding over time. Yet it remains quite notable to think that Israel's God was not known by the name of Yahweh, but by a different divine name, and one that was quite well known outside of Israel. El is famous all around Israel, not just at Ugarit. Stated differently, Israel shared a faith in the god El, whom its neighbors also knew, and perhaps before its faith in Yahweh. Here we may encounter an early sort of ecumenical realization as part and parcel of Israel's earliest religious identity. The god El is perceptible in a number of other sources, and I'm not going to go through them all. I think I have some listed on the handout. Many biblical verses bear the imprint of older tradition about El. Interestingly enough, the Bible does not polemicize against El, but incorporates this God. Cast in theological terms, we might say, note the hedge there, we might say, that El and Yahweh meet or converge in the same Israelite Godhead. Something to think about. There are other traces of gods and goddesses on the biblical God discernible in the Bible. The imprint of the goddess Asherah in the Bible was perhaps more subtle, but certainly no less profound in the figure of personified woman wisdom who is associated with the tree of life in Proverbs 3:18. I have to remind that the symbol of the goddess Asherah was a tree called the Asherah, tree or pole. The point also applies to the god Baal, who has this title, Rider of the Clouds, which was adapted to Yahweh in Deuteronomy and Psalm 68. And I've already mentioned the name of Leviathan and Baal's other enemies that came to be attributed to Yahweh in the Bible. These traces of different deities in Yahweh point to Israel's incorporation of their features into what I would like to call the Israelite Godhead. And in these cases, we also begin to see the outline of a shared religious heritage with respect to divinity, which would continue with the invasions of Assyria and Babylonia. Under invasion from an empire with its empire god, Israel's God would become an empire god and more. An empire god not for an empire people, but for a conquered people, a people in exile, a colonized people. The Cosmology of Mesopotamia, as attested in Enuma Elish, it's sometimes called the creation epic, as well as other texts of Mesopotamia, focus on Marduk and sometimes on other gods, such as Ninurta, as the one God above all other gods and in whom they have their reality. This is something we already see in Mesopotamia. Such Mesopotamian explorations in divinity may have aided Israel's thinking about its God in the midst of and adapted to its own difficult circumstances. Israel's engagement with Mesopotamia yielded a God of world power, yet also a consoling God for a disempowered people. Like Mesopotamian texts about Marduk and some other Mesopotamian gods, Israelites came to regard its God also as a God unlike any other God, and it went further in understanding Yahweh as the only God with reality in the universe. Thanks to the texts from Ugaritic and Mesopotamia, we can see these features more clearly, and we can see the process of divinity developing in Israel in ways that have parallels in the ancient Near East. And thanks to the texts from Ugaritic and Mesopotamia, we begin to appreciate more richly the range and depth of divinity singly concentrated in the biblical God. It is only with a broad Catholic vision of studying the Bible across the ancient Near East and informed by the ancient Near East that scholars can, Catholic or not, they can understand God as enshrined in the Bible. Let me close with a few comments. Looking back on the scholarly labor on divinity in ancient Israel, we can see that it's not simply about origins, and it's not only about what appears as the end product. It's also not about an exalted, sublime notion of monotheism. It is no less about the great change in Israel's experience of itself, its world, and its God, an endless project of open-ended revision. Divinity in the Bible is divine paradox in motion, shrouded in mysterious beginnings, middles, and ends, none fully determinative for any religious tradition, and none, I suspect, fully grasped by any religious tradition. Finally, our story involves how our field of biblical studies is moving and changing, and also how, God willing, the church is moving and changing. Our field, our sources, our deity are interrelated, moving targets that we can rarely grasp altogether. All three show motion, complexity, and mystery. It is the important work of all in faith communities in light of their own incarnate experience, not to simplify the Bible or its God, but to embrace the Bible's revelatory motion and complexity, as well as its intimations of the mystery of its God. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Smith. We have time for those of you in the audience to perhaps pose a question or two. The members of our symposium that are meeting during the next few days will have to abscond at about 6:30, as will Professor Smith. But if anyone would like to ask a question or a clarification or a follow-up, please raise your hand, and we have a microphone coming around right there or there.
To what extent are the Old Testament concepts of sin, atonement, and the mercy or hesed of God unique to the Israelites, or was that inherited or shared with the other people around them?
Very good question. So we have sin, lots of sin. But sin is not just biblical. We got a lot of sin in the ancient Near East. That is, if the texts are any indication. So we have from Ugaritic a great sort of atonement, communal atonement text, and we also have texts, a lot more texts from Mesopotamia that also have this complex. So themes of sin and atonement are and in fact, we just have a recent book by Isabel Krantz on the topic for Mesopotamian texts on this very theme, and comparing them with biblical materials from Leviticus. It's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you. Not wanting to push you or invite you to exceed the boundaries that you set forth at the beginning of your talk, but the image that you use of the donut and the hole in the donut of the relationship with monarchy is Am I racing ahead to say that lays a template for the relationship of the church and the Roman Empire?
Well, so let me see if I can unpack a few different elements that I hear in your question. So if it's, I was speaking about really monarchically produced texts and texts that are directly about kings in their own time as being that donut. But in sources throughout the Bible, there's a lot of reflection about monarchy. I mean, you might say that most every part of the Hebrew Bible has or is a kind of response and struggling with monarchy, its loss, the loss of Jerusalem, etc. So you might say there's plenty of monarchy in the Bible in that sense as response to this loss. And this is what gets carried forward. That it's interesting. What gets carried forward as you move into 2nd century, 1st century, the time of Jesus, is a complex set of responses that are picking up on this question of what does monarchy mean, or what did monarchy mean, and what does it mean today? And that itself is a topic for at least 2 or 3 lectures. That response combines a recovery of both texts that really, I think, were produced for monarchy, like some of the oracles, all the things that we like to read in churches, for Christmas and etc. Those are oracular materials from, Isaiah or the Psalms or whatever. So that's one kind of recovery for later, but it's also filtered through post-monarchic sensibilities and contours. And so is this going to be a literal kind of monarchy? Is it going to be God's inbreaking in history? Is this going to be a human expectation? There's a huge, extremely complex set of notions operative in the time of Jesus. There's not like this one, expectation. It's really very complicated. And so if you have a more specific follow-up to that you'd like me to speak to, I could try, but it's really very complex. But I do like to get away from something I hear sometimes from my Christian students. They'll say, Jews expected X at the time of Jesus. And that's like saying, Catholics all think X. I just don't believe it. And the sources don't really bear that out.
I had more in mind the way that the New Testament texts were used by the early Christian community rather than laying the groundwork for the Messianic expectation.
I admit I'm not really New Testament scholar, and I don't want to work without a license. I've got New Testament friends here who they might not approve of that. I don't know. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yes. Can you explain what the cultural context was when the scriptures were composed, when the Hebrew scriptures were composed, and how they were able to get cross-fertilized with the other cultures and statements about God?
Well, so the Bible's produced over a 1,000-year period. So there's not like one moment where we sort of sit down and the Bible's now composed. It's this ongoing, and it's incredibly complicated. How, not just the different times, but what's going on in each of those times and how each subsequent period receives the tradition that it has in these texts, and they're carrying it on, and that goes on and on and on. I think texts start to be read. So we largely think of individual books or even parts of books being produced, and we often we sort of say, well, there's this tradition, there is tradition, etc. Priestly tradition or Deuteronomic tradition, things like that, or royal tradition. But we also see cross-referencing happening at a certain point in time. And that itself is one of the most interesting questions for biblical scholars. And there are different conditions and different ways in which that's happening. It's not like all one thing. So my own personal favorite example is we're used to the Psalms as being, the traditional ascription of authorship is to David, because that's what a lot of the labels say at the top. Now, most biblical scholars don't really think that David wrote all these Psalms. And there's a good reason why they don't. For example, one of them refers to the temple. Well, it's kind of, unless you think David is being presented as a prophet in the psalm, then that's, although he is understood later in the tradition that way, the psalm itself doesn't look like a prophetic text. That just doesn't feel real likely. Okay, but they have these titles because they want you to read and understand the Psalms as they give you a very sophisticated, incredibly impressive, almost literary theological side of David. When they link the Psalms to David, and they're linked to episodes in the books of Samuel, what they're doing is, you read all of Samuel, and most of the time, there's an exception or two. You don't get, well, what did David feel in these circumstances? And what the Psalms perform is, whoever writes these titles, connecting them to David, saying, this is what it was like for David. And it's incredibly impressive. My God, why have you forsaken me? It's incredibly powerful, this kind of linkage between the books of Samuel and the book of Psalms. But I could talk about all kinds of other examples from other parts of the Bible where they're starting, and I have to admit, I haven't figured this out well enough to know, but I think this is part of this post-monarchic project of the Bible coming together in different ways. It's not just, I've got all these different blocks of material, but I'm understanding these blocks of material in reference to one another. So I can't possibly do justice to what your question really fully asks. But now the second part of the question had to do with all these ancient Near Eastern cultures. And I think it's going on all the time. Israel is coming out of an ancient Near Eastern culture. I was talking about Ugaritic texts. And it's impacted not just by Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and then later Romans for the New Testament, but already earlier, before the Assyrians, we see Phoenician impact, and we see some Aramaic impact. So there's think about any country you know today. There's cultural influences. It was a porous world in the ancient Near East. And that's something, it's hard for, I think for years, it took me a very long time to think, okay, it was a porous world for Israel. And that implies, when you can actually show the data, you want the evidence, that it's a porous world for understanding who Israel's God was for Israel. It's complicated. Thanks for your question.
Hi, Professor Smith. I'm James Page.
Okay, sorry, sorry about that.
A graduate student over at the STM. Apologies, I'm a little starstruck, so if I stumble over my words, I'm sorry. I was just wondering if you'd feel comfortable addressing some of the criticisms that are sometimes leveled against this kind of evolutionary scholarship or understanding of...
Well, I'd avoid, I think, first of all, slapping evolutionary on it is itself a way of criticizing it.
Okay.
For starters. You didn't hear me use the word evolution. Evolution. Now, right. And I'm not really that worried about it. But I think the fact is that there are changes in any societal history. You think the United States is today what it was in 1776? So, the idea of change over time is something I can live with as a concept. So do you have a follow-up to that, though?
Well, yeah, it was just so people who would... maybe draw upon the same parallels you do, and they wouldn't necessarily describe it as creatively recycling material, but they'd say it's creatively subverting material. What would you say to...
Well, I think that in some cases, if you use the word subvert, then it implies a kind of criticism of it at the same time. Is that fair to say? Let's just be clear about what you mean by subvert. Okay. So I think I do think that there are some places in the Bible. So when I ask a question like this, I want to know, can I see signs of it? I don't want to assume it. I lead a data-driven life. I would look for signs of it. And there are signs. There are signs where you're sort of seeing they're taking the motif or they're taking the language and they're playing with it, and they might even be playing with it in a way that's also pushing back. But that's one of a half dozen strategies. And I wouldn't make that the rubric for understanding all of this intercultural engagement. Thanks for your question.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My question is about inspiration, particularly with translation of the Bible, specifically with the Septuagint, given that there's some variations in certain words, like the translation of the handmaid with virgin in the Septuagint, so on and so forth.
Isaiah 7:14, right.
Correct.
Right, yeah.
Can we say that translation in that Hellenistic context is a source of inspiration, a kind of a way through which God allowed for this kind of new interpretation? Is that legit? Can we say that? Just like you were talking about the how the Ugaritic Texts influenced the production of the Bible.
Well, before I address that particular example or another example, let me just say that what I'm doing is working, in effect, backwards from what I see in the Bible to what I see in these other texts. Okay? I mean, I'm not going to just compare any old thing. And believe me, that's been done in the history of biblical studies. So the baseline is starting with that text itself. So I don't mind understanding the Septuagint as an interpretation of Alma, a young woman in Isaiah 7:14. Am I going to call it inspired is another question. And that question is, who's the we in that sentence? That is, your question was, can we call it inspired? So who the we is critical. If I answer the question as if I'm working sort of my more academic side, I'm not really that worried about inspiration per se. I'm interested in understanding, I've got this text, I have this text, I'm going to try to understand them as best as possible, and I see the interpretive endeavor involved. To call something outside of the Bible, at least the Hebrew Bible as we have it in the first moment, in the Septuagint, is itself a long topic of discussion within the church. And it even predates the church. That is the story of the Septuagint. There was an inspiration story given to the Septuagint in the letter of Aristeas, which is not a Christian text. So already this idea that somehow translation would be inspired is something that the church, in fact, inherited from Jewish tradition in Alexandria. This is not I don't want to say this is a general Jewish notion. It's the community in Alexandria which generated this idea, because that's where the translation took place into Greek in the first place. So I think it's in part a question of studying or trying to understand. First of all, again, back to my sort of historical sensibility, before I want to say, can we say, we want to know what they said. And so studying the letter of Aristeas, studying early Christian sources, and the discussion over the status of the Septuagint as inspired and to what degree, et cetera, is something to be looked at first before I would even be comfortable, addressing this question, say, theologically. And because I haven't done that, I can't really answer your question. Great cop-out, right? No, but it's true. I mean, that's the way I feel about it. Yes, I hear, I see, and I obey.
Well, the particularly good news in that last exchange is that we can all still enjoy Christmas this year.
I'm not going anywhere near. I love Christmas. Don't touch my Christmas.
In any case, it gives me again great pleasure to thank you, Professor Smith, for the talk and for the stimulation that you've provided us all this evening. And on behalf of the crowd, I'd like to one more time thank you very much.